You are a garden where nothing grows, Selene. You are useless to me. The words cut deeper than any claw. Selene stood in the pouring rain, the mud soaking into the hem of her ruined silk dress. She didn't cry. She refused to give him that satisfaction. But her heart shattered as Alpha Jackson, the man she had loved for 5 years, threw her suitcase down the stairs of the pack house. It burst open, scattering her clothes into the dirt. Behind him, clinging to his arm and smirking, was Lola. Younger, prettier, and heavily pregnant. "The pack needs an heir," Jackson sneered, his voice booming so the watching crowd could hear every humiliating word. "I need a real wolf, not a broken vessel. By the laws of the syndicate, I reject you, Selene. I sever the bond." Selene felt the metaphysical snap in her chest, a physical agony that brought her to her knees. She wasn't just losing her husband. She was losing her home, her rank, and her identity, all because her womb had remained empty. The rain fell harder, as if the sky itself wept for what she had lost. Her knees sank into the mud, silk dress ruined beyond repair, but she couldn't feel the cold anymore. The physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow void opening inside her chest where the mate bond had been. It felt like someone had reached inside her ribcage and torn out a vital organ, leaving her bleeding from a wound no one else could see. Around her, pack members watched from windows and doorways. Some looked away in shame. Others whispered behind their hands, their eyes gleaming with the sick satisfaction that comes from witnessing another's downfall. Not one of them stepped forward to help. Not one of them challenged their alpha's judgment. She had been their Luna for 5 years, had tended their sick, had mediated their disputes, had celebrated their joys and mourned their losses. But in the end, she was just the barren wife, disposable, forgettable. Lola's laughter cut through the rain, high and cruel. "Don't worry, Selene," she called out, her hand resting on her swollen belly in a gesture that was pure mockery. "I'll take good care of your house, and your husband. A real Luna knows how to give her alpha what he needs." Selene's fingers dug into the mud. She wanted to scream. She wanted to shift and tear that smug smile off Lola's face. She wanted to make them all see that she wasn't broken, that there had to be another explanation, that 5 years of desperate hopping and praying and trying couldn't all be for nothing. But she didn't, because deep down, in the place where her wolf used to sing, she had started to believe them. Maybe she was broken. Maybe there was something fundamentally wrong with her, some cosmic punishment for sins she couldn't remember committing. Maybe Jackson was right to throw her away. "Get out of my territory," Jackson said, his voice flat and final. "You have until dawn. If you're still here when the sun rises, my warriors have permission to remove you, permanently." He turned his back on her then, pulling Lola close and walking into the pack house. Her pack house, the one she'd helped build, the one where she'd planned to raise children who would never exist. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in her bones. Selene knelt there in the mud and rain for a long time, watching her clothes float in the puddles, watching the pack members slowly return to their homes and their lives, watching the lights in the pack house windows glow warm and golden while she froze in the darkness outside. She had nowhere to go. Her family had died in a rogue attack years ago. The friends she'd thought she had were pack members first, and they wouldn't risk their alpha's displeasure by helping her. She had no money. Everything had been in Jackson's name. No pack would take in a rejected mate. It was considered bad luck, a sign of the moon goddess's disfavor. She was truly, completely alone. Finally, when her body had gone numb from the cold and her tears had mixed with the rain until she couldn't tell them apart anymore, Selene forced herself to stand. Her legs shook. Her chest ached with every breath. But she gathered what she could salvage from her burst suitcase: a few pieces of clothing, a photograph of her parents, a silver hairbrush that had been her grandmother's, and stuffed them into a torn travel bag. Then she walked, away from the pack house, away from the territory boundaries, away from everything she had known and loved and lost. She didn't look back. That was 3 months ago. Now, the once-proud Luna was a ghost haunting the neutral lands, a dangerous strip of untamed forest between the territories. Selene had learned to survive on berries and rabbits, sleeping in trees to avoid the feral rogues. She had convinced herself that she was destined to die alone, that she was broken. The neutral lands were exactly as their name suggested, neutral, but not safe. They belonged to no pack, followed no laws, offered no protection. They were the space between civilizations, where rogues hunted and feral wolves lost their humanity entirely. Most wolves avoided them. Those who entered rarely left. Selene had learned to move through the forest like smoke, leaving no trail, making no sound. She'd learned which berries were safe and which would make her sick. She'd learned to fashion snares from vine and catch rabbits, though the first time she'd had to kill one with her bare hands, she'd wept for an hour afterward. She'd learned to sleep in the branches of massive oaks, wedged into forks where she wouldn't fall, because sleeping on the ground meant waking up dead. She'd lost weight. The hollows of her cheeks had deepened, her collarbones prominent beneath her dirt-stained tunic. Her silver hair, once her pride, now hung in tangled mats. Her clothes were held together with hope and improvised stitching. She looked like exactly what she was, a reject, surviving but not living, existing in the spaces between worlds. The loneliness was worse than the hunger. At night, when she huddled in her tree branches and listened to the howls of feral wolves below, she would press her hand against her chest and try to remember what it felt like to have a mate bond, to feel connected to someone, to matter to another living being. But the memory was fading, replaced by the constant ache of absence. She talked to herself sometimes, just to hear a voice. She'd have full conversations, playing both parts, pretending someone cared enough to ask how she was doing. She knew it was a sign of deteriorating mental health, but she couldn't seem to stop. The silence was too heavy, too absolute. There were moments when she thought about just giving up, about walking down from her tree and letting whatever came in the night take her. It would be faster than starving, cleaner than the slow erosion of hope, but something stubborn in her chest, maybe her wolf, maybe just spite, kept her going. One more day, and then another, and then another. She had convinced herself that this was her life now, that she would exist in this gray space between life and death until her body finally gave out, that she deserved this purgatory for the crime of being unable to conceive. But fate has a twisted sense of humor. It happened on a Tuesday. Selene was washing her face in a freezing stream when the birds suddenly went silent. The air grew heavy, charged with static electricity. Before she could run, they emerged from the tree line. 6 massive wolves, but these weren't rogues. They were larger than any she had ever seen, their fur black as midnight, moving with military precision. And in the center stood a man who didn't need to shift to command terror. King Ronan, the Blood King of the North. Selene froze. Ronan was a myth, a ruthless warlord who had slaughtered entire packs for looking at him wrong. Legend said he had never taken a mate because he viewed love as a weakness. The stories about the Blood King were the kind that mothers used to frighten disobedient pups. They said he'd killed his own father to take the throne. They said he could tear a wolf's throat out before they even saw him move. They said he ruled the northern territories with an iron fist, that his dungeons were filled with the bones of those who displeased him, that he'd once razed an entire pack to the ground because their alpha had insulted him at a gathering. They said he had no mercy, no compassion, no heart. And here he was, standing not 20 feet from her, flanked by wolves so large and lethal they made her instincts scream to run. But there was nowhere to run. She was weak from malnutrition, exhausted from 3 months of barely surviving. If he wanted her dead, she'd be dead before she made it 3 steps. She backed away, snapping a twig. Ronan's head snapped toward her. His eyes weren't the amber of a normal wolf. They were a piercing, electric violet. Those eyes pinned her in place more effectively than any physical restraint. They were the eyes of a predator who had never known defeat, who had looked at death so many times he'd become intimate with it. They should have been cold. They should have been empty. Instead, they burned. Selene prepared to die. She lowered her head, baring her neck in submission, waiting for the execution order. At least it would be quick. At least she wouldn't have to endure another winter in the neutral lands, wouldn't have to watch herself waste away slowly. There were worse ways to die than at the hands of the Blood King. She heard his footsteps, deliberate and measured, moving closer. She closed her eyes, sent a silent prayer to the moon goddess, though she wasn't sure the goddess listened to rejects anymore. thought of her parents, and hoped she'd see them again on the other side. "Mine," a deep voice rumbled, shaking the leaves off the trees. Selene blinked, looking up. The king wasn't looking at her with bloodlust. He was looking at her with a terrifying hunger. He stepped closer, ignoring his guards, and inhaled deeply, not smelling the mud or the poverty, but something else. The word didn't make sense. She must have misheard, must have imagined it in her fear-addled mind. Because there was no universe in which the Blood King looked at a starving reject covered in mud and said, "Mine." But he was still approaching, and his guards weren't attacking, and that look in his violet eyes was growing more intense with each step. It wasn't the look of a man about to kill. It was something else entirely. Something that made her skin prickle with awareness despite her terror. "You smell like winter," Ronan whispered, stopping inches from her trembling form. "And you smell fertile." Selene gasped. "No, my king, I am barren. My mate rejected me." The words tasted like ash. She'd said them so many times in her own head, rehearsed them like a mantra during the long nights, that they felt like the only truth she knew. I am barren. I am broken. I am worthless. The holy trinity of her new identity. Ronan let out a dark, dark laugh that sent shivers down her spine. He reached out, his rough thumb grazing her jaw. His touch was electric. It had been 3 months since anyone had touched her with anything other than violence in mind. 3 months since she'd felt the warmth of another living being. The simple contact of his thumb against her skin made her want to weep. "Your mate was a fool who couldn't plant a seed in a storm," Ronan growled. "Come with me, little wolf, and I will show you exactly what happens when a king claims what belongs to him." Selene didn't move. She couldn't. Her boots were rooted in the damp moss of the neutral lands, her breath trapped in a chest that felt too tight for her heart. The legends surrounding the Blood King were written in ash and bone. They said he was a monster who felt nothing, a warlord who ruled the north with a heart of black ice. Yet, as King Ronan circled her, the air didn't smell of death. It smelled of ozone and pine, a scent so overpowering it made her dormant wolf whine in submission. Her wolf, the part of her that had gone silent after the rejection, that had curled up in some dark corner of her soul and refused to come out. That wolf was stirring now, responding to something in the air, in the scent, in the sheer presence of the males circling her like she was prey worth hunting. "Look at me," he commanded. It wasn't a shout, but the sheer weight of his alpha aura forced her chin up. She met his gaze, expecting to see disgust, the same look Jackson had given her for 5 agonizing years. She expected him to see the ribs showing through her dirt-stained tunic, the hollows of her cheeks, the invisible brand of Barren that she carried like a scarlet letter. She was a reject, a failed Luna, a dead end for any bloodline. But Ronan wasn't looking at her failures. His nostrils flared as he inhaled deeply, his eyes narrowing as they swept over her trembling form. He stepped closer, invading her personal space until the heat radiating from his massive frame chased away the forest's chill. The warmth was almost painful against her perpetually cold skin. She realized with a start that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be warm. Really warm, not just the temporary heat of a small fire that barely kept hypothermia at bay. This was the warmth of another living being, of an alpha in his prime, of power made flesh. "They told you that you were empty," Ronan murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the soles of her feet. "They told you that you were a garden where nothing grows." How did he know those exact words? Had Jackson's rejection speech spread that far? Was her humiliation now entertainment for the entire syndicate? The thought made her stomach twist with fresh shame. "I am," Selene whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "My former mate. He tested me. I cannot produce an heir. I am of no use to a king." Ronan let out a sharp, derisive snort. He reached out, his rough, calloused hand cupping the back of her neck. The touch was possessive, electric. He leaned down, burying his face in the crook of her shoulder, inhaling the scent gland there. Selene flinched, waiting for him to recoil from the scent of her inadequacy. This was it, the moment he'd realize the truth. The moment he'd pull back with disgust and order his guards to end her. Because what king wanted a broken female? What use was she to anyone? Instead, A low growl of approval ripped from his throat. The sound vibrated against her skin, primal and possessive. It was the sound a wolf made when claiming prey, when finding something precious, when recognizing something that belonged to them. "Lies," he hissed against her skin. "I do not smell failure on you, little wolf. I do not smell a withered vine." He pulled back, his violet eyes blazing with a terrifying intensity. "I smell power. I smell a lineage so old it has been forgotten by the weaklings in the South. You do not smell like a reject. You smell like a queen." Selene stared at him, stunned into silence. A queen. The word felt foreign on her tongue. She'd been Luna once, yes, but that was different. That was a role, a position. This was something else. Something that resonated in her bones despite her disbelief. "The nose of a true alpha does not lie," Ronan stated, stepping back to offer her his hand. It was a gesture of equality, shocking his guards who stood silently in the shadows. "Your mate was weak. His blood was too thin to spark the fire dormant in your veins. He blamed the wood because he could not strike a match." The metaphor hit her like a physical blow. He blamed the wood because he could not strike a match. 5 years of being told she was the problem. 5 years of tests and treatments and herbs and prayers. 5 years of apologizing for her body's failure, of watching Jackson's disappointment grow into resentment and finally into cruelty. 5 years of believing she was fundamentally broken. What if it had never been her fault at all? He waited, his hand steady in the space between them. "I am not weak, Selene, and I do not make mistakes. Come with me. Leave this exile behind, and I will prove to you that you are not broken. You were just waiting for a storm strong enough to wake you." Selene looked at the hand. It was large, scarred from battle, the hand of a warrior who had killed without mercy. It should have terrified her. It should have made her run screaming in the other direction. But it was also steady, offered not demanded, waiting for her choice. It was a choice between dying alone in the mud or walking into the fire with a monster who looked at her like she was a deity. For the first time in months, a spark of defiance lit up her chest. She reached out and placed her dirty, scarred hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid and real. The touch sent a jolt through her system, waking parts of her she'd thought were dead. Her wolf stirred again, rising from its place of mourning, lifting its head to scent the air. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't broken after all. The ride to the northern war camp was a blur of shadows and thundering hooves, but for the first time in months, Selene was not cold. They'd given her a horse, or rather, she'd been placed on one because she'd been too weak to mount by herself. One of Ronan's guards, a massive brute with a scar bisecting his face, had lifted her into the saddle like she weighed nothing. Then Ronan had mounted behind her, his arms bracketing her body as he took the reins, and they'd ridden. The forest passed in a blur of green and brown. The wolves, Ronan's guard, ran alongside them, their massive forms moving through the underbrush with predatory grace. They moved like a military unit, coordinated and lethal, nothing like the chaotic feral packs that roamed the neutral lands. Selene had expected to be questioned, interrogated about why she was in the neutral lands, about her past, about her rejection, but Ronan said nothing. He simply held her against his chest, his body heat seeping into her frozen bones, his presence a solid wall of protection at her back. She must have dozed off at some point, exhaustion finally claiming her, because the next thing she knew, they were slowing to a stop. She blinked awake to find herself in a massive military encampment. Tents stretched as far as she could see, organized in precise rows. Wolves in human and animal form moved with purpose between them. The scent of cooking meat made her stomach clench with hunger so sharp it hurt. Ronan dismounted first, then reached up to lift her down. His hands spanned her waist easily, and she realized with a flush of shame just how thin she'd become. She could see his jaw tighten as he set her on her feet, his eyes scanning her malnourished frame with something that looked like anger. But not at her, never at her. "Feed her," he ordered one of his guards, "and prepare the command tent. She is not to be disturbed." Then he was striding away, barking orders, every inch the warlord king. Selene stood there, swaying slightly, wondering if this was all a fever dream, if she'd actually died in the forest and this was some strange afterlife. But the guard was pressing a water skin into her hands, and the water was real and cool and the best thing she'd tasted in months. And then there was bread, fresh bread, still warm, and cheese and strips of dried meat. She wanted to devour it all, but her stomach had shrunk, and she could only manage a few bites before nausea threatened. The guard watched her with a surprisingly gentle expression. "Slow," he rumbled. "Small amounts, your body needs time." She nodded, clutching the food to her chest like treasure. They led her to a tent, not just any tent, but a massive structure that could have housed 20 people. Inside, a fire roared in a central pit, the smoke venting through a cleverly designed opening in the roof. Furs covered the ground, thick and luxurious. There was a campaign table covered in maps, a rack of weapons, and in the corner, a bed that looked impossibly soft. Wrapped in the king's heavy fur cloak, sitting before a roaring fire in his private command tent, the chill of the neutral lands finally began to thaw from her bones. Yet the ice in her heart remained. She watched King Ronan pour dark red wine into 2 iron goblets, his movements precise and predatory. He hadn't touched her since the forest, but his gaze felt like a physical caress, heavy and constant. He filled both goblets with wine so dark it looked like blood in the firelight. Rich, expensive wine, the kind served at alpha gatherings, the kind she hadn't tasted since her rejection. The scent alone made her head spin. "Drink," he said, pressing a goblet into her hands. "It will warm the blood." Selene took a sip, the vintage rich and expensive, a sharp contrast to the muddy water she had been surviving on. The wine hit her empty stomach like liquid fire, spreading warmth through her veins. She took another sip, then another, feeling the alcohol soften the sharp edges of her reality. She set the cup down, her hands trembling. She couldn't play this game. She had to know the price of her rescue before she let herself hope, because there was always a price. She'd learned that the hard way. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "You are the Blood King. You could have any unmated female in the syndicate. Why take a reject? You heard what I said in the forest. I am Barren. I cannot give you an heir." The word Barren tasted like poison on her tongue. She'd said it so many times it had become part of her identity. Selene the Barren, Selene the Broken, Selene the Useless, titles she wore like chains. Ronan stopped packing. The tent grew suffocatingly quiet. He turned slowly, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows across his scarred face. "Is that all you think a female is worth, Selene? A vessel for genetic legacy?" The question caught her off guard. She looked down at her hands, thin and scarred from 3 months of survival. "It is what the syndicate values," she whispered, looking at her hands. "A king needs a lineage. Jackson." Jackson said a crown without an heir is just a hat. "If I cannot give you sons, I am useless to your throne." She'd heard the speech so many times. From Jackson, from his beta, from the pack healers who'd examined her month after month, their expressions growing more disappointed each time. From Lola, who'd whispered it with false sympathy while handing her another cup of poison tea. Aluna's purpose is to bear the next generation. Without that, what are you? Ronan moved with blurring speed, crossing the distance between them in a heartbeat. He knelt before her chair, not in submission, but to force her to look him in the eye. He took her chin in his hand, his grip firm but not painful. "Jackson was a boy playing at leadership," Ronan growled, his violet eyes burning with intensity. "He needed sons to validate his weak existence. I do not." He leaned closer, his breath hot against her face. The scent of him, pine and ozone and something uniquely alpha, filled her senses. "I have an army that shakes the earth when it marches. I have wealth that could buy the southern territories 3 times over. My legacy is carved in the history books, not in a cradle. I have no need for pups, Selene. I have no need for a broodmare to sit quietly in a nursery." Each word was a revelation, a challenge to everything she'd been taught, everything she'd internalized. She stared at him, trying to process this fundamental shift in worldview. He brushed a stray lock of silver hair from her forehead, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I am surrounded by sycophants and cowards who fear my shadow. I do not need an heir. I need a partner. I need a queen who has walked through hell and come out the other side still standing. That is what I smell on you, not emptiness. Resilience. Selene stared at him, her breath hitching. He wasn't asking for her fertility. He was asking for her soul, for her strength, for the part of her that had survived 3 months in the neutral lands when any sane wolf would have laid down and died. I offer you my protection, Ronan said, his voice dropping to a vow. I offer you my name, not as a mother but as a ruler. Stand beside me and no one will ever look down on you again. The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Selene felt tears prick her eyes, real tears, not the bitter ones of shame she'd cried in the rain 3 months ago, but tears of something she'd thought was lost forever. Hope. For the first time in 5 years, the knot of shame in Selene's chest loosened. She nodded, a single tear escaping to trace a path through the dirt on her cheek. Yes, she whispered, I will stand. Ronan's expression softened into something she couldn't quite name. He rose, pulling her to her feet with him, and for a moment they simply stood there, the fire crackling between them, the weight of the moment settling over them both. Then rest tonight, little wolf, he said quietly. Tomorrow, we see if your previous mate was lying about more than just your worth. The words sent a chill down her spine, because if Jackson had been wrong about her being barren, what else had he been wrong about? Or worse, what if he'd been right and Ronan was simply being kind to a broken woman who had nowhere else to go? But she was too exhausted to think about it anymore, too worn down to question this strange mercy. So she simply nodded and let herself be led to the bed in the corner, where she collapsed into furs softer than anything she'd felt in months. She was asleep before her head hit the pillow, and for the first time in 3 months, she didn't dream of rain and rejection. She dreamed of violet eyes and a hand offered in the darkness. The infirmary of the Northern Legion was a structure of heavy canvas and timber, smelling of antiseptic and sage, far removed from the pristine, white-tiled clinics of the South. Selene had been awake for hours, but she'd spent most of that time simply staring at the tent ceiling, trying to convince herself that yesterday had been real, that the Blood King had really offered her protection, that she was really here in the Northern War Camp instead of dying slowly in a tree. But the summons had come at dawn, a polite but firm request from the king himself. She was to report to the infirmary for examination, and though it was phrased as a request, Selene knew an order when she heard one. So here she sat on the edge of the examination cot, her legs dangling, feeling small despite the heavy fur cloak Ronan had draped over her shoulders. The king stood in the corner, arms crossed, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. He hadn't left her side since they arrived. She'd expected him to send guards, to have her examined and then reviewed the results later, as any busy king would. But he was here, watching, his violet eyes tracking every movement the healer made. The royal healer, an elderly wolf with eyes like clouded glass, pulled the needle from Selene's arm and transferred her dark blood into a glass vial. He had been silent for 20 minutes, humming in a way that made Selene's stomach twist. She knew what was coming. He would tell her what every doctor in Jackson's pack had told her. Her womb was a desert. The silence stretched. The healer swirled the vial, held it up to the light, frowned, swirled it again. His humming stopped. His expression shifted into something Selene couldn't quite read. You can say it, Selene whispered, breaking the silence. I know the diagnosis, infertility. She'd heard it so many times, from so many healers, each one delivering the verdict with varying degrees of sympathy, but always the same message. Your body is broken. You will never carry a child. She'd memorized their pitying expressions, their careful explanations of hormone imbalances and inhospitable wombs and mysterious conditions that had no cure. The healer didn't look up. He held the vial against the light of the oil lamp, swirling the liquid. It didn't settle right. It was too dark, sluggish. His frown deepened. Infertility is a condition, Luna. What I am seeing here is not a condition. It is a crime. The word crime landed like a stone in still water, rippling outward. Selene blinked, not understanding. The healer's voice had gone cold, clinical rage barely contained beneath his professional demeanor. Ronan stepped forward, the air temperature dropping instantly. "Explain." The healer turned, his expression grave. "There is a residue in her blood. Faint, because she has been starving in the neutral lands for months, which ironically saved her life. But the traces are unmistakable. Wolfsbane. Specifically, a distilled tincture mixed with moonflower." The words didn't make sense at first. Seleni's brain tried to process them, to fit them into the narrative she'd been living for 5 years. Wolfsbane, poison, but she'd never been poisoned. She'd been tested. She'd been diagnosed. Selene blinked, the room spinning. "Wolfsbane kills wolves, I would be dead." "Not in microdoses," the healer corrected gently. "In small, consistent amounts, it doesn't kill the host. It attacks the reproductive system first. It forces the body into a constant state of toxic shock, making conception impossible. You were not barren, child. You were being poisoned." The world tilted on its axis. Time seemed to slow. Selene could hear her own heartbeat, loud in her ears, could feel the blood draining from her face, could sense Ronan's mounting rage like an approaching storm, but it was distant, muffled, because her entire reality was reconstructing itself, and she couldn't breathe around the implications. Memories flashed through Selene's mind like a horror reel. The headaches, the constant nausea, and the fertility teas that Lola, the pack's helpful herbalist and Jackson's favorite mistress, had prepared for her every morning with a sweet smile. "Drink up, Luna. It will help." Every morning for 3 years. 3 years of Lola bringing her special tea, brewed with herbs she claimed would boost fertility. 3 years of Selene drinking it religiously, desperately, because she would have done anything to conceive, to save her marriage, to prove she wasn't broken. And all that time, Lola had been poisoning her. Lola had been poisoning her while sleeping with her husband, while carrying her husband's child, while stealing her life one drop of toxin at a time. "Lola," Selene breathed, the name tasting like bile. "She made me tea, every day for 3 years. She said it was to help me conceive." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Lola, who'd been so sympathetic, who'd hugged her when another month passed without pregnancy, who'd told her it wasn't her fault, that some wolves just couldn't carry, that she shouldn't blame herself, who'd handed her cup after cup of poisoned hope and watched her drink it with a smile. A low, guttural sound ripped through the tent, the sound of a predator about to kill. Ronan's hands were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He wasn't looking at the healer. He was looking at Selene with a mixture of horror and absolute volcanic rage. "They didn't just reject you," Ronan said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. "They murdered your future. They poisoned you under your own roof while you wept for a child they were stealing from you." The quiet fury in his voice was more frightening than if he'd shouted. This was the Blood King. This was the warlord who'd razed Pax to the ground, and she could see in his eyes that he was already planning retribution. Selene looked down at her hands. The shame of the last 5 years, the feeling of being broken, less than a failure, began to crack. Beneath it, something hotter and sharper began to bleed through. She wasn't broken. She had been betrayed. By the woman she'd thought was trying to help her. By the husband who'd blamed her for a failure he'd engineered. By an entire pack that had watched her suffer and said nothing. "Can it be fixed?" Ronan demanded, his violet eyes locking onto the healer. Selene held her breath, because this was it, the moment of truth. If the damage was permanent, if 3 years of poison had destroyed her reproductive system beyond repair, then what did it matter that she'd been betrayed? She'd still end up exactly where Jackson had said she belonged, barren and useless. "The poison is leaving her system," the healer nodded. "With the right antidotes and the strength of a true alpha's proximity. Yes, she is young. She can heal." The words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. She can heal. Not maybe, not we'll see, but a definitive statement of fact. She could heal. Her body could recover. She wasn't fundamentally broken. She'd been deliberately sabotaged, and the sabotage could be undone. Ronan moved to the cot, placing a hand on Selene's shoulder. It wasn't a comfort. It was a promise of retribution. "Then heal her," he commanded. "Flush that filth from her veins, and when she is strong, the South will learn that poison works both ways." The detox wasn't a medical procedure. It was an exorcism. That's what it felt like anyway. Like something dark and malevolent was being torn from her body, piece by agonizing piece, and her body was fighting the loss even though it was killing her. For 3 days, Selene burned. The antidote the healer administered forced her body to purge the wolfsbane that had settled deep in her marrow over the years, triggering fevers that spiked high enough to make her hallucinate. She thrashed on the furs, crying out as phantom pains tore through her womb, her body screaming as it expelled the toxins that had stolen her life. On the first day, she saw Jackson standing over her, telling her she was worthless. She screamed at him, curses she'd never had the courage to say to his face, but when she blinked, he was gone and there was only the tent ceiling and the concerned face of a healer hovering above her. On the second day, she saw Lola, smiling that sweet smile, offering her a cup of tea. "Drink up, Luna, it will help." But this time, Selene could see the truth beneath the smile, the malice, the calculation, the cold satisfaction of destroying another woman to take what she wanted. Selene tried to knock the cup away, but her arms wouldn't cooperate, and she wept with frustration until someone's voice cut through the fever. "It's not real, little wolf. She's not here. You're safe." On the third day, she saw her mother, who died when Selene was barely more than a pup. Her mother, who told her she was strong and brave and capable of anything. Her mother, who'd never know what her daughter had become, a reject, a exile, a woman so desperate for love she'd drunk poison willingly. "I'm sorry, Mama," Selene wept. "I'm so sorry." "Hush, child. You have nothing to apologize for." But the voice wasn't her mother's. It was deeper, rougher, with an accent that spoke of northern mountains and winter storms. Through the haze of agony, one thing remained constant: the anchor of a heavy, calloused hand holding hers. King Ronan did not leave. He delegated the war council to his generals. He ignored the messages from the southern borders. The Blood King, known for his impatience and brutality, sat by her bedside with the stillness of a mountain. When the fever made her teeth chatter so hard she thought they would crack, he didn't call for a nurse. He stripped off his armor, climbed into the bed behind her, and pulled her shivering body against his chest, using his supernatural alpha heat to warm her. "Breathe, Selene," he would murmur against her ear when the pain peaked. "Let it burn the past away. I am here." His presence was the only thing that kept her tethered to reality. When the hallucinations came, his voice cut through them. When the pain became unbearable, his warmth reminded her she was still alive. When she wanted to give up, to let the darkness take her because surely dying was easier than this, his hand would tighten on hers and his voice would rumble through her bones. "Stay with me, little wolf. I am not done with you yet." It was in the quiet moments between the bouts of sickness that the dynamic shifted. One evening, as the fever finally broke, leaving her weak and drenched in sweat, Selene opened her eyes to find Ronan wiping her forehead with a cloth dipped in ice water. His movements were shockingly gentle for a man who could crush a skull with one hand. The tent was quiet except for the crackling of the fire. Night had fallen outside. She could tell by the darkness beyond the canvas walls. How long had she been unconscious this time? Hours, days. "You stayed," she rasped, her voice raw from screaming. Ronan paused, his violet eyes tracing the line of her jaw. "Where else would I be?" "Leading your armies, running your kingdom, doing anything other than babysitting a broken reject." The words came out bitter, exhausted. "I am weak," she whispered, looking away. "I look hideous." And she did. She could feel it. The sweat-soaked hair plastered to her skull. The hollow-eyed, skeletal appearance of someone who'd been through 3 days of hell. The smell of sickness clinging to her skin. She was everything unattractive, everything repulsive. Why was he even here? Ronan hooked a finger under her chin, turning her face back to his. "You look like a survivor," he corrected softly. "I have seen men beg for death with half the pain you have endured this week. You did not beg, you fought." He dropped the cloth and let his thumb brush over her lower lip, his gaze dropping to her mouth. The air in the tent shifted, the smell of antiseptic fatting beneath the rising scent of pine, ozone, and arousal. The intimacy of the last few days, the vulnerability of her naked suffering and his unwavering care, had stripped away the formalities of rank. "The poison is gone," Ronan said, his voice dropping to a rumble that vibrated in her chest. "Your body is your own again, Selene, and soon I will ask for the right to claim it, not to breed an heir, but because I have grown fond of the fire you hide behind those sad eyes." The admission sent heat flooding through her body that had nothing to do with fever. She should have been afraid, should have questioned his motives, should have protected her heart against this dangerous intimacy growing between them. But she was so tired of being afraid, so tired of protecting herself, so tired of being alone. Selene didn't pull away. For the first time, she didn't feel like a broken vessel. She felt seen. She leaned into his touch, her heart hammering a new rhythm against her ribs. "I think," she whispered, "that I am growing fond of the storm." Ronan's eyes darkened with something primal and possessive. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to refuse, to pull back, to remind him of their differences in station and situation. She didn't move, didn't retreat, just held his gaze and waited. His lips brushed hers, soft as snowfall, a question in the gentleness. When she didn't pull away, the kiss deepened, became more certain, more claiming. It was nothing like the perfunctory kisses Jackson had given her, duty performed without passion. This was heat and hunger and a promise of things to come. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. "Rest now, little wolf," Ronan murmured against her hair. "When you wake, you will be strong again, and then we will show the world exactly what they threw away." Selene closed her eyes, cocooned in his warmth, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she was worth something after all. 2 months of peace had almost convinced Selene that the nightmare was over. Her strength had returned, gradually but steadily. The first week after the detox, she could barely walk from the bed to the tent entrance without exhausting herself. But each day, she pushed a little harder, walked a little farther, ate a little more. The hollow places in her cheeks began to fill out. Color returned to her skin. Her hair, properly washed and cared for by servants who treated her like she mattered, regained its lustrous silver sheen. But the changes weren't just physical. For the first time in years, maybe in her entire life, Selene felt safe. Not just protected, but genuinely safe. Safe to speak her mind. Safe to make mistakes. Safe to simply exist without constantly calculating how to make herself smaller, quieter, less of a burden. Ronan's court was nothing like Jackson's pack. Here, strength was valued, but so was intelligence. Warriors respected her strategic mind when she pointed out flaws in their defensive positions. The cooks welcomed her suggestions about food storage and distribution. Even the lowest-ranked wolves greeted her with genuine respect rather than the performative deference she'd received as Luna. And Ronan was a revelation. The Blood King, the ruthless warlord of legend, was patient with her in ways that made her chest ache. He never pushed for the mating bond to be completed, though she could see the hunger in his eyes when he looked at her. He included her in war councils, asked her opinion on matters of state, and actually listened when she spoke. He taught her to fight, basic self-defense at first, because she'd spent so long as a pampered Luna that she'd never learned, and praised her progress instead of criticizing her failures. They spent evenings by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his childhood, about the brutal father he'd been forced to kill in self-defense, about building his kingdom from bloodshed and refusing to perpetuate his father's cruelty. She told him about her parents, about life before Jackson, about dreams she'd buried so deep she'd forgotten they existed. Her cheeks had filled out, and the hollow ache in her chest had been replaced by the steady, burning warmth of Ronan's mate bond. They hadn't officially completed the mating ceremony, yet Ronan wanted her fully healed first, wanted her to have time to be certain, wanted her to choose him without any shadow of desperation or gratitude clouding her judgment. "I don't want you to pick me because I saved you," he'd said one night, his violet eyes serious in the firelight. "I want you to pick me because you can't imagine your life without me. There's a difference." And God's help her, she was starting to understand what he meant. The warmth in her chest wasn't gratitude. It was something deeper, something that made her seek him out in crowded rooms, that made her smile when she heard his voice, that made her want things she'd thought were forever beyond her reach. But in every way that mattered, she belonged to him. Not in the way she'd belonged to Jackson, as property, as a symbol, as a means to an end, but in the way two wolves belong to each other when they recognized something fundamental in one another, when they looked at each other and thought, "There you are. I've been waiting for you." The incomplete bond hummed between them, patient but present, a promise waiting to be fulfilled, a future waiting to be claimed. But fate, it seemed, was not done testing her. It happened during the midday meal in the Great Hall. The Northern War Camp had grown into something resembling a permanent settlement over the past 2 months. Ronan's generals and their families had joined them, along with civilians who'd pledged themselves to his service. The Great Hall was a massive tent structure reinforced with timber, large enough to hold 100 people for meals and gatherings. Selene had grown comfortable here. She knew the faces around her, had learned names and stories. She sat at the high table beside Ronan, participating in the easy banter of his inner circle. General Marcus had just finished telling a ridiculous story about a training mishap involving a confused bear, and the table was roaring with laughter. One moment, Selene was laughing at a joke from one of Ronan's generals, reaching for her goblet of water. The next, the room tilted violently to the left. The laughter died in her throat. The goblet blurred in her vision, suddenly too far away, as if she were looking at it through the wrong end of a telescope. A wave of nausea, sharper and more vicious than the detox sickness, slammed into her gut like a physical blow. The world turned gray. Sounds became muffled and distant. She tried to stand, tried to excuse herself, but her legs weren't receiving commands from her brain. The goblet slipped from her numb fingers, clattering loudly against the stone floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot in her ears. "Selene." Ronan's voice sounded underwater, distorted and far away. She tried to answer, tried to tell him she was fine, that she just needed air, that this was nothing to worry about. But her tongue was thick in her mouth, uncooperative. The room spun faster, the edges of her vision going dark and fuzzy. She tried to stand, to assure him she was fine, but her knees turned to water. The darkness rushed in, swallowing the light. The last thing she felt was strong arms catching her before she hit the ground, and the terrified roar of a king watching his queen fall. The roar was primal, anguished, the sound of a male watching his mate die and being powerless to stop it. It was the last thing she heard before the darkness claimed her completely. When she woke, she was back in the infirmary, the scent of sage and antiseptic choking her. The transition from unconsciousness to awareness was jarring. One moment, there was nothing. The next, she was drowning in sensation, the scratch of furs beneath her, the assault of medicinal smells, the overwhelming sense of wrongness in her body that she couldn't quite name. The panic in the room was palpable. Ronan was packing the small space like a caged tiger, his aura flaring so wildly the timber beams were creaking under the pressure. She'd never seen him like this. The control she associated with him had shattered, leaving raw terror in its wake. His hands were clenched into fists, his violet eyes wild, and he was muttering something under his breath that sounded like prayers or threats or both. The royal healer was hovering over her, his hands glowing with diagnostic magic, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool temperature. 2 assistant healers flanked him, their expressions grave and focused. "It's back, isn't it?" Selene whispered, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. "The poison, the damage was too deep. My body is shutting down." It was the only explanation that made sense. The sudden collapse, the overwhelming sickness, the wolfsbane must have done more damage than they'd realized. 3 years of consistent poisoning had destroyed something fundamental, and now her body was finally giving up. This was how it ended. Not in the neutral lands, alone and forgotten, but here, surrounded by people who'd come to care for her, dying just when she'd started to believe in a future worth living. Ronan stopped packing instantly. He was at her side in a blur, gripping her hand so hard it almost hurt. "You are not shutting down. If the poison remains, we will burn it out again. I will not let you go." His eyes were wide, frantic, the look of a man who had conquered armies but was helpless against biology. The Blood King, the warlord who'd never shown weakness, looked utterly terrified. His hands were shaking where they gripped hers. His breathing was harsh and uneven. She'd never seen him afraid before, and somehow his fear made hers worse. "My king, please," the healer interrupted, his voice shaking but firm. "I need absolute silence. The pulse is erratic, fast, very fast." Too fast for a dying woman, his tone implied. Too fast for a body shutting down. Fast in a way that suggested something else entirely, but he needed silence to determine what. The room fell deathly still. Even Ronan went motionless, though she could feel his pulse hammering where his hand pressed against her wrist. Selene squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the death sentence. Waiting to hear that the wolfsbane had finally won, that Lola's poison had destroyed her from the inside out, that she'd been living on borrowed time all along. The healer pressed his ear against her lower abdomen, frowning. His expression was intense, concentrated, listening to something only his trained senses could hear. He moved to the left, then to the right. His frown deepened, then transformed into something else, confusion, then shock, then dawning wonder. His frown vanished, replaced by a look of utter, slack-jawed shock. He pulled back, blinking rapidly as if he couldn't believe his own senses. "It is not the poison," the healer breathed, his voice trembling. The words hung in the air. Selene's eyes flew open. Ronan's grip on her hand tightened painfully. "Then what?" Ronan started, but the healer held up a hand. "The nausea is quite natural, actually," the healer continued, his voice gaining strength and certainty. "Though usually it is not this severe this early. But given the trauma her body has endured, the detox, the malnutrition before that, it makes sense that her system would react strongly." "Speak plainly," Ronan snarled, the veins in his neck bulging. "What is wrong with her?" The command carried all the weight of his alpha authority, sharp enough to make the assistant healers flinch. But the old healer simply smiled, his clouded eyes bright with something that looked almost like joy. "Nothing is wrong, sire," the healer said, a slow, incredulous smile spreading across his wrinkled face. "She is not dying, she is creating." The words didn't make sense. Selene's brain tried to process them, to fit them into a framework that made sense, but they wouldn't cooperate. Creating. What did that mean? Creating what? Selene froze. "What?" "I hear a heartbeat," the healer announced. He paused, tilting his head, his expression shifting from wonder to absolute astonishment. "No, wait." The pause stretched. Selene couldn't breathe. Ronan had gone completely still beside her, his hand frozen around hers. He looked at Selene with wide, amazed eyes. "I hear too." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating and absolute. Two heartbeats, not hers, not Ronan's, but two separate, tiny, impossible heartbeats that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, because she was barren. Because 5 years of tests and treatments and specialists had all said the same thing: she would never carry a child. Selene stared at the ceiling, her hand drifting instinctively to her flat stomach. "Two," she choked out. "But I am barren," Jackson said. The name tasted like poison on her tongue. Jackson, who'd tested her. Jackson, who'd brought in specialist after specialist. Jackson, who'd declared her broken beyond repair. Jackson, who'd thrown her away because she couldn't give him what he needed. "Jackson was a fool," Ronan whispered. The ferocity drained from his face, replaced by a look of stunned wonder. He fell to his knees beside the bed, his height suddenly irrelevant, his power and authority meaningless in the face of this impossible miracle. He placed his large, warm hand over hers on her stomach, covering it completely. "Two heartbeats," he repeated, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You are not empty, Selene, you are overflowing." Selene couldn't speak, couldn't think, could only lie there with her hand on her stomach and Ronan's hand covering hers, feeling for something she couldn't detect, but that the healer swore was there. Two lives, two impossible, beautiful, terrifying lives growing inside the body that everyone had declared barren. Inside the womb that Lola had poisoned for 3 years. Inside the woman Jackson had thrown away like garbage. How, she finally managed. The poison, the damage, how is this possible? The healer moved closer, his expression gentle. The detox worked better than we hoped. Your body is young, resilient. Once the toxins were cleared, your natural systems began to repair themselves. And the proximity of a true alpha. He glanced at Ronan with something like reverence. The mate bond, even incomplete, provides powerful healing. Your body recognized what it was waiting for and responded. Twins, Selene breathed, the word foreign on her tongue. I'm carrying twins. Strong ones, the healer confirmed. Their heartbeats are steady, healthy. The accelerated healing from the bond has protected them, even through the collapse. They are fighters, like their parents. Ronan's hand trembled against her stomach, and when Selene looked at him, she was shocked to see moisture in his eyes. The Blood King, the ruthless warlord, was crying. I told you, he said, his voice rough. I told you that you were not broken, that you were just waiting for the right storm. Selene started laughing and crying at the same time, the emotions too big to contain. Everything she'd been told was a lie. Everything she'd believed about herself was wrong. She wasn't barren. She wasn't defective. She wasn't useless. She was going to be a mother. And not just to one child, but two. Two miracles that shouldn't exist but did anyway, growing in the garden that Jackson had called a wasteland. The South, she said suddenly, realization dawning. Jackson, when he finds out. Ronan's expression hardened, the wonder giving way to cold calculation. When he finds out, it will destroy him, as it should. He stood, his hand still covering hers on her stomach, protective and possessive. But that is a problem for later. Right now, you need rest. The healer will monitor you closely. Nothing, and I mean nothing, will threaten you or our children. Our children. The word sent a thrill through her. Not his heirs, not burdens or obligations, but their children, wanted and precious and already loved. I need to make arrangements, Ronan continued, already planning. Additional healers, guards, will need to move you to more comfortable quarters. The campaign tent is no place for. Ronan, Selene interrupted softly. Breathe. He stopped, looked down at her, and something in his expression softened. I am not accustomed to feeling helpless. I can command armies, but I cannot protect you from this. I can only wait and hope and be here, Selene finished. That's all I need, just be here. He nodded, lowering himself back to his knees beside her bed. Always, little wolf, I will always be here. The healer cleared his throat delicately. If I may suggest, Your Majesty, announcing this development at the winter solstice would be impactful. Ronan's smile was sharp and predatory. Yes, it would. Selene's heart began to race for an entirely different reason. The winter solstice, the gathering of the alphas, where every pack leader in the syndicate would be present to pay tribute to the king, including Jackson. You want to invite him, she realized. You want him to see. I want him to understand exactly what he threw away, Ronan corrected. I want him to stand in my hall and smell the scent of my pups on you. I want him to realize that the problem was never you, Selene. It was always him. It was vindictive. It was cruel. It was petty and vengeful and absolutely perfect. Do it, Selene said, her own smile matching his. Invite them all. Let the entire syndicate see what a fool looks like. The winter solstice was not merely a holiday in the Northern Territories. It was a display of dominance. The preparations began weeks in advance. The war camp transformed gradually, growing into something that resembled a permanent settlement. Temporary structures gave way to solid buildings. The Great Hall was expanded, reinforced, made magnificent. Traders arrived with goods from across the territories, silks and spices, wines and delicacies, everything needed to host the gathering to end all gatherings. The ice palace transformed into a fortress of crystal and light, with chandeliers made of diamonds reflecting the roaring fires that kept the Arctic chill at bay. Servants scurried through the corridors carrying bolts of velvet and crates of imported wine, preparing for the gathering of the alphas. The one night a year where every pack leader in the syndicate was summoned to pay tribute to the king. Selene watched it all with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Her body was changing daily now. The sickness had passed after the first week, replaced by an appetite that amazed her. She was hungry constantly, craving things she'd never liked before. The healer said it was normal, that her body was feeding not just herself, but two rapidly growing pups. The changes were subtle at first. A fullness in her face, a roundness to her hips, a tenderness in her breasts that made certain movements uncomfortable. But by the time the solstice arrived, there was no hiding the gentle swell of her lower abdomen. She was showing. Not dramatically, she was only 3 months along, but enough that anyone looking would know. Especially anyone with a wolf's enhanced senses who could smell the changes in her scent, could hear the dual heartbeats if they listened closely enough. Selene stood before a floor-to-length mirror in her chambers, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach. It was small, barely a bump beneath the layers of silk, but to her, it felt like a mountain. She'd moved from the infirmary to proper quarters a month ago, a suite of rooms that were hers alone, though Ronan visited so frequently they might as well have been shared. He'd been insistent that she have space, autonomy, the ability to be alone if she needed it. But most nights, she ended up in his tent anyway, or he ended up in hers, and they'd fall asleep tangled together like they'd been doing it for years instead of months. 2 heartbeats, 2 miracles growing in the garden that Jackson had called a wasteland. A shiver of anxiety traced her spine, not for the bobbies, but for what the solstice represented. The South would be coming. Jackson would be coming. With Lola, presumably, and their child. Selene tried to imagine that confrontation and couldn't. Too many emotions tangled together, rage and hurt and vindication and fear. What would she say to them? What would they say to her? The heavy oak door creaked open, and Ronan entered. He was already dressed in his ceremonial blacks, a heavy fur cloak draped over one shoulder, looking every inch the warlord king. He stopped behind her, his eyes meeting hers in the reflection. He didn't speak immediately. He simply wrapped his arms around her waist, his large hands splaying protectively over her abdomen. The gesture had become habitual over the past month. Ronan touched her stomach constantly, as if reassuring himself that the miracle was real, as if he could protect their children through sheer force of will and the warmth of his palms. "You are thinking about them," Ronan rumbled, his chin resting on the top of her head. "I am thinking about the whispers," Selene admitted softly. "The southern pack still know me as the rejected Luna. They know me as the Barren wolf who was thrown into the mud." The old shame tried to rise, but she pushed it down. She wasn't that woman anymore. That woman had died in the neutral lands. The woman standing here now was stronger, harder, forged in fire and poison and survival. "Let them whisper," Ronan said, his voice hardening. "Because tonight I intend to scream the truth." He reached into his tunic and pulled out a scroll of parchment sealed with the royal crest. He placed it on the vanity table before her. "The guest list was finalized this morning. I made a specific addition." Selene unfurled the scroll with trembling fingers. Her eyes scanned the names of powerful alphas, each one representing a major pack or territory. The Ironwood Pack, the Silvercrest Pack, the Mountain Territories, the Coastal Clans, all the major powers of the syndicate, along with dozens of minor packs seeking favor with the king. Her eyes stopped dead at one name near the bottom, Alpha Jackson of the Southern Fang Pack. Her breath hitched. Seeing his name in writing made it real in a way her imagination hadn't. He was coming here, would stand in Ronan's hall, would see her, would know. "You invited him," she whispered, looking up at Ronan in horror. Why bring him here?" Part of her understood. Part of her even wanted it, wanted to see his face when he realized the truth, wanted him to suffer the way she'd suffered. But another part of her, the part that still remembered loving him, that still carried the scars of his rejection, was terrified. What if seeing him broke something in her? What if she couldn't handle it? Ronan turned her around, his violet eyes burning with a cold, calculated fury. "Because I want him to see you. I want him to stand in my hall, surrounded by my army, and look at the woman he discarded." He stepped closer, his hand covering hers on her stomach, protective and possessive. I want him to smell the scent of my pups on you. I want him to realize that the fault was never in the soil, Selene. It was in the farmer who was too weak to tend it. The metaphor sent a thrill through her, not just because it vindicated her, but because of the absolute certainty in Ronan's voice. He didn't just believe she wasn't broken. He knew it, had never doubted it, even when she doubted herself. It will destroy him, Selene realized. In the syndicate, rejecting a fertile mate was a catastrophic error of judgment. It signaled weakness. It signaled incompetence. Other alphas would question his leadership, his strength, his ability to judge situations correctly. His pack might even challenge him, seeing the rejection as evidence of flawed decision-making. Good, Ronan growled, leaning down to kiss her forehead. The kiss was gentle, but his voice was steel and ice. He tried to erase you. Tonight we will ensure he never forgets you. Wear the gold dress, my queen. We have a victory to parade. The gold dress had been Ronan's idea. Selene had wanted something modest, something that would downplay her condition. But Ronan had been insistent. No hiding, he'd said firmly. No shame, no apologies. You are carrying the future of the Northern Territories. That is something to celebrate, not conceal. So the dressmakers had created something that was the opposite of modest. The gown was liquid gold silk, cut scandalously low to showcase the healthy glow of her skin, and fitted tight, unforgivingly tight, against her torso. There was no hiding the swell of her abdomen in this dress. It might as well have had an arrow pointing to her stomach with the words, "Not Barren," written in glowing letters. It was provocative, deliberate, and absolutely perfect for what Ronan had planned. Selene had protested at first. It felt too vulnerable, too exposed. But when she'd finally tried it on and looked in the mirror, something had shifted in her chest. She looked powerful, regal, like a queen who had nothing to apologize for and everything to celebrate. Her silver hair was arranged in an intricate style, woven with black diamonds that caught the light. Her skin glowed with health. And the dress made a statement that no words could match. I am here, I am whole, I am carrying life, and you were wrong about me. Now, standing in the antechamber just outside the great hall, listening to the murmur of 500 guests beyond the doors, Selene felt her resolve solidify. She wasn't the broken woman Jackson had rejected. She was something new, something stronger, and tonight the entire syndicate would see it. Ronan stood beside her, magnificent in his ceremonial armor, his violet eyes burning with pride and possessiveness. Are you ready? Selene took a deep breath, her hand resting on her stomach, feeling the life within her. Yes, let's show them what they missed. The fanfare of the trumpets cut through the murmur of 500 guests, signaling the arrival of the Northern Sovereign. At the far end of the ballroom, the massive double doors of iron and oak groaned open, revealing the couple framed by the winter night. The herald's voice boomed, shaking the crystal chandeliers, presenting King Ronan of the bloodline of ice and his queen, Selene. A ripple of confusion tore through the crowd. The name was familiar, but the title was impossible. Selene, the rejected Luna from Southern Fang, surely not the same woman. Surely the Blood King hadn't taken a reject as his queen. The name was familiar, but the title was impossible. The southern wolves nearest the entrance craned their necks, whispering the rumors that had traveled across the borders, rumors of a rejected, broken female who had crawled away to die. Selene stepped into the light, and the whispers died instantly. She was not the gaunt, mud-stained exile Jackson had thrown from his porch. She was a vision of celestial vengeance. Her silver hair cascaded down her back like moonlight, crowned with a tiara of black diamonds that caught the firelight and threw it back in sharp, defiant sparkles. But it was the dress that stole the air from the room. It was a gown of liquid gold silk, cut scandalously low to showcase the flushed, healthy glow of her skin, and fitted tight, unforgivingly tight, against her torso. The fabric clung to her curves, highlighting the undeniable, proud swell of her lower abdomen. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't something that could be explained away or dismissed. It was life, obvious and impossible and absolutely real. King Ronan walked beside her, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, guiding her through the parting crowd. He radiated a smug, lethal pride, his violet eyes daring anyone to look away. But no one could. The crowd parted before them like water before the prow of a ship. Selene kept her chin high, her expression serene, as they walked the length of the great hall. She could feel every eye on her, could hear the whispers starting again, louder now, spreading like wildfire. It can't be, she's carrying, but she was barren, the king chose a reject, she's pregnant. Near the buffet tables, Alpha Jackson stood frozen, a half-eaten canapé forgotten in his hand. Beside him, Lola, who was visibly showing, though looking pale and haggard, tugged on his sleeve, asking a question he didn't hear. Jackson felt as if he had been punched in the throat. He'd been nursing a goblet of wine, making small talk with other Southern alphas, when the trumpets had sounded. He'd turned with everyone else, expecting to see the Blood King and whatever mate he'd chosen. He'd heard rumors that Ronan had taken a queen, but names hadn't been confirmed. He stared at Selene, his eyes wide with a mixture of recognition and horror. He knew that face. He knew those eyes, but he did not know this woman. This woman walked like she owned the world. This woman glowed with health and power. This woman wore gold like she was born to it and carried herself with a confidence that made his Luna, his actual, chosen Luna, look small and diminished by comparison. And that dress, that scandalous, impossible dress that left no question about her condition. As Selene drew closer, the scent hit him. It wasn't the stale, sickly smell of the fertility tonics Lola had forced on her for years, the smell he'd associated with Selene for so long that he'd forgotten she might smell any other way. It was the rich, overwhelming aroma of milk and honey. It was the scent of a female in the prime of her cycle, blooming with life. And underneath it all, the sharp, distinct scent of not one, but two new heartbeats. His wolf recognized it before his human mind could process. Two. She was carrying two. Jackson's glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The sound echoed in the sudden silence, but he didn't blink. He watched the curve of Selene's stomach as she passed, his wolf howling in agony inside his chest. She's carrying, he stammered, the realization crashing down on him like a landslide. She isn't barren. The words came out strangled, disbelieving, because it couldn't be true. He'd had her tested. The best healers in the South had confirmed it. She was barren, broken, defective. He'd made the right choice rejecting her. He'd made the logical decision. He had thrown away a diamond because he was told it was glass. And now, that diamond was wrapped in the gold of a king, carrying a legacy that should have been his. Lola said something beside him, her voice sharp and panicked, but he couldn't hear her over the roaring in his ears. Couldn't focus on anything except the woman in gold walking toward the royal dais, one hand resting protectively on her swollen stomach, the other tucked into the arm of the most powerful alpha in the syndicate. She should have been his. Those pups should have been his. That power, that position, that triumph, all of it should have been his. Instead, he'd cast her out, had thrown her into the rain and mud, had told her she was worthless, had rejected the mate bond in front of his entire pack. And she'd found a king. If you loved seeing Selene claim her crown and her justice, please subscribe and join our pack. We are building a community of survivors, dreamers, and fierce souls who know that a no from the world is just a yes to something better. I want to hear your voice in the comments. Have you ever been in a situation, a relationship, a job, or a friendship, where you were blamed for a failure that wasn't actually your fault? Did you find your Ronin, or are you still working on your own healing? Let us know below. Your story might be the hope someone else needs to read today. Don't forget to like this video to show the algorithm that we love strong queens, and share it with a friend who needs a reminder that they aren't broken. They're just waiting for their storm. See you in the next story.